only learn teaching techniques, but you learn about the Indigenous culture. And the theater arts are especially important to us for the children and their learning experience. We're also developing a Chinachli program where we will be actually providing seminars and teaching experiences for teachers that they can take into their classrooms. So we're going to be supplementing what teachers are learning in college and hopefully bringing that to their classrooms when they become professional educators. And lastly, I'd like to talk to you about our repatriation program. Briefly, repatriation is where we are seeking our ancestors that are being held by institutions, educational institutions, museums, in cardboard boxes stored as collections. It's our effort to obtain those ancestors and rebury them, return them to Mother Earth. In our culture, we believe that when you die, two things happen. The spirit goes on a journey to the great mystery, and the body returns to Mother Earth to become part of the natural cycle. And so both of those actions are just critically important to our spiritual belief. So when one of our ancestors is unearthed and put in a cardboard box, the spiritual journey stops, and of course, the integration with Mother Earth stops. There are over 7 million of our ancestors being held by institutions all over the country. Here in Texas, over 2,400 of our particular tribal people are being held by the University of Texas. And it's our desire to work with the university to obtain those ancestors and return them to Mother Earth. So along with supporting us in interaction with higher education, personally, I'd like to ask you to take action to help us in repatriating our ancestors.
Thank you, Maria. With your blessing, I'll also call out the Nakum Journal, which some of our ATHE members might be interested in, and certainly not only potentially submitting, but also letting others, Indigenous scholars know about that. And then also during the conference, there's the opportunity to see Yanaguana's Legend of the Bluebonnet. Did you want to say anything about that?
Well, I'm inviting everyone to please come and watch the screening. You are going to be absolutely amazed at this play. This production is also was initially done by the Dallas Children's Theater, but we followed up with our own Indigenous production using Indigenous ways of knowing and being and producing this particular show that you're going to watch. Then afterwards, we're going to have a talk back with all Indigenous. All of the staff and crew were Indigenous, and some of the Indigenous artists are going to be in the talkback. So we hope you can join us for that during the conference.
Thank you, Maria. And I want to thank Courtney Mohler again for the work, and Bethany as well for the work to bring ICI here. And thank you again, Maria, for this blessing and opening this morning that will lead us into an amazing keynote that I'm looking forward to. So I'll hand it back over to Anne, and thank you again.
Hi, Roxanne. Thank you. Thanks so much for that. Thank you, Maria, for that fabulous blessing. Kicking off the ATHE 2021 conference in such a beautiful way. Thank you as well, Roxanne, and both of you for introducing us and telling us more about the fabulous resources of the Indigenous Cultures Institute. I'm really excited for that performance, to see it later in this conference, as well as to engage much more explicitly with all of the events and possibilities that ATHE can share with the Indigenous Cultures Institute when we return to Austin in 2023. My name is Josh Abrams. I'm the current president of ATHE, and it's my privilege to welcome you all here today. It's lovely to see so many fabulous names, so many familiar names, I would say, and faces, and new, as well as new members and new participants in the list of attendees scrolling on the right-hand side of my screen. While I'd far prefer to be with you all in person, it's lovely to see those names and to see the chat starting to pop up. It's my privilege, as I say, to welcome you all here to this, but really the bulk of this belongs to Anne Hago, our fabulous Vice President for Conference 2021. She and her team have done an extraordinary job putting together this conference, the events of the next week, and I am really excited by everything that they have put together. I'm really excited, especially about this opening keynote, starting with Tai and Mary Kathryn in conversation with Courtney. I can't wait to hear these fabulous thinkers and all of the great conversation that ensues from there. So on behalf of the Governing Council and the focus groups, on behalf of the volunteer leadership of ATHE, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you all here today. Thank you so much for being here and joining us, and I hope to see you in many Zoom rooms over the next few days. Anne, if you'll join me on this virtual podium.
Hello. Good morning, and Josh, thank you for that introduction, and Maria, thank you so much for sharing the blessing with us this morning, and Maria and Roxanne for sharing with us information about the Indigenous Cultures Institute. I'm speaking to you today from Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois, which is located on the traditional lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Weah, Miamia, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe nations. These Native nations lost their ancestral lands in central Illinois through violent forced removals and broken treaties. The lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their people, the caretakers, just as the people continue to carry the stories of this land. I invite conference attendees throughout the next days to share your acknowledgments in your chats, or as you are invited to do so by your session leaders. The conference committee acknowledges our responsibility not only to understand these histories, but also to actively confront the ways in which colonial policies and thinking continue in our personal and professional lives. In the theater specifically, we must recognize that this industry has been complicit and even instrumental in misrepresenting Indigenous people, both in its literature and on its stages, and in marginalizing Indigenous people and cultures. We commit to create change and progress. In the spirit, we welcome you to the 2021 ATHE conference, RE ATHE. The committee has curated performances, plenaries, and keynotes that we hope will drive the ongoing conversations about anti-racism and decolonization into action. Although many of us may be disappointed, as I am, that we are not gathering in person in Austin, the committee has retained glimpses of Austin's artists and venues in the programming, including evening performances that we hope you will all attend. We hope that these will pique your interest in Austin and that you will return for the 2023 conference, which will be held in the same lovely conference hotel on the river in Austin. Before introducing our keynote speakers, I want to take just a moment to introduce and thank the fabulous 2021 Dream Team, your conference committee. These are the individuals who coordinated this year's keynote, plenaries, performances, workshops, and online social engagement. And if you have a minute to drop a thank you in the chat, if you see them in a session, or drop an email to them if you have their email address, that would be lovely. They have done a considerable amount of work over the last year. They are Roxanne Schroeder-Arce, who you just saw from the University of Texas at Austin, Jane Barnett from the University of Kansas, Cassidy Browning from the University of Texas at Austin, Veranda Carey from Oakton Community College, Teresa Dudek, independent scholar, Lemuel Island, University of Pittsburgh, David Jortner, Baylor University, Reza Mirsajidi, DePaul University, Courtney Elkin Mohler, Butler University, Mitchell Ost, Indiana University Bloomington, Travis Stern, Bradley University, and also Connor Maccabee from Illinois State University, who is also my graduate assistant through this year. Thank you for all of your work. And now I think that we will turn to our keynote presentation. Good morning again, everyone. In my introduction for this keynote, I wrote that I am honored to introduce Tai Defoe and Mary Kathryn Nagle. And that is not just a figure of speech. It is my true honor, and I am very humbled to introduce Tai Defoe, Mary Kathryn Nagle, and Courtney Elkin Mohler, and to welcome you all to the first keynote in ATHE's history from Indigenous artists. For those of you who do actually know me, not just as a face on a screen, you won't be surprised to hear me follow that by saying it's about damn time. Thank you to the conference committee, and particularly to Courtney Elkin Mohler, who has been instrumental in arranging this keynote and who will be facilitating the dialogue. Tai Defoe Gizig is an award-winning Oneida and Ojibwe writer and interdisciplinary artist who aspires to an interweaving approach to artistic projects with social justice, indigiqueering, and environmentalism. He is a core member of All My Relations Collective, an art equity facilitator, and co-founder of Indigenous Direction with Larissa Fasthorse, who were awarded ATHE's 2020 Leadership in Community-Based Theater Award. Tai's full bio, including theater and Broadway credits in writing, acting, movement direction, and choreography, is available on the conference website and will be linked in the chat. Mary Kathryn Nagle is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation and a partner at Pipestem and Nagle Law, where she works to protect tribal sovereignty and the inherent right of Indian nations to protect their women and children from domestic violence and sexual assault. She served as the first executive director of the Yale Indigenous Performing Arts Program and is an alum of the 2013 Public Theater Emerging Writers Program. Her complete production credits are included also in her bio in the conference program, which will be linked in the chat. I also want to note that the virtual performance library includes links to some of Tai's and Mary Kathryn's work, including a 15-minute excerpt from the OSF production of Mary Kathryn's Manahatta, for which Tai served as movement director. Courtney Elkin Mohler will facilitate the keynote dialogue. She is an associate professor of theater and associate dean for inclusion, diversity, equity, and access at Butler University. And she also serves as the focus group representative for the Latinx, Indigenous, and the Americas focus group. Thank you all.
Kakinash. Haku, haku, pitap, Courtney Elkin Mohler. Kakti, kakti, nali, senta, wala wala. Hello, my name is Courtney Elkin Mohler and I come from Santa Barbara, California. I did not, unfortunately, grow up speaking Barbareño Chumash, and neither did my father. And so I relish the opportunity to practice the fragments that I'm busy learning whenever I can. So thank you for letting me do that. I'm logging in today from my adopted home of Central Indiana and would like to acknowledge that I am a guest on the traditional lands of the Indigenous people, including the Potawatomi, the Miami, the Delaware, and Shawnee. And that as we honor the land itself and the Indigenous peoples past and present who have stewarded it throughout the generations, we also are called to do better now ourselves. Thank you all so much, ATHE community, for attending this conversation between two of the most influential Indigenous theater makers in North America. As far as the shape of the event, I will pose a few questions to Mary Kathryn and to Tai in order to get our conversation started. But we really would love for this to be as substantive and engaging for our audience as possible. So we invite you to pose your questions at any time in the chat. In the last portion of the conversation, we will open it up for any questions or topics that Anne will kindly flag, and she'll send them out, and so that Mary Kathryn and Tai can answer them. So without much further ado, I'm going to go ahead and begin with an open-ended kind of biography question. And please do excuse my small children are screaming loudly in the background. Although we have been very careful extremely careful. My husband and I are vaccinated. My 2 daughters, even though they were masked, have been sent into quarantine after 2 days of school. And so they are here when they otherwise would be learning elsewhere. So I will remind them to keep it down. All right, so Mary Kathryn, would you please tell us a little bit about your journey as a playwright and also how you view the relationship between your work as an attorney and legal scholar and your work in theater? And I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off. And then actually, if we want it just to kind of go naturally into Tai talking a little bit about his biography and professional work, that question for you is, you've been lauded for your work in so many different arenas, Tai, and you absolutely live up to the title of multidisciplinary shape-shifting artist. Would you please share a little bit about the work you do and your artistic journey? So this is a question about your biography and how it has influenced and influences your artistic work.
Well, thank you so much for that question, Courtney, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. After such an incredible introduction, it's hard to know exactly where to start. And as was mentioned, I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and so I am from Oklahoma, but live in Washington, D.C. these days, where I do work as an attorney. And I think, the question of sort of how I got started on this journey of making theater is, our communities have been storytelling, have been telling stories for thousands of years. It's how we've survived. It's how we've survived. And I think I have always understood the power of story and revered it, and was, as a small child, very excited to get involved in theater, and also really understood the importance of the law. I think in large part because that was an understanding that my grandmother gave to me. My great-great-great-grandfather, John Ridge, was one of the first Native attorneys in the history of the United States. And so I grew up hearing the stories about the work that he did for our nation, along with Principal Chief John Ross, to fight in the United States Supreme Court at a time when, the executive and legislative branches were attempting to eradicate our nation and every tribal nation east of the Mississippi at that time. And certainly, we won this huge victory in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. And the Supreme Court looked at our treaties that Cherokee Nation had signed with the United States and said, the United States refers to the Cherokee Nation as a nation. That means something. And treaties are the supreme law of the land in the US Constitution. And therefore, Cherokee Nation is the only sovereign with criminal jurisdiction within Cherokee Nation's borders. It was a huge, huge victory for Cherokee Nation. I knew growing up that I wanted to be an attorney, and thought that, unfortunately, when I was in college and sort of trying to make these life decisions, thought, well, probably won't be able to do both. I guess I'll go to law school, and thought I was giving up this dream of working in the theater. And as it turns out, I was very blessed at the law school that I went to, Tulane, to find some fellow students who were interested in continuing theater with me. And so while I was in law school, I wrote and produced some plays that my fellow students and the faculty acted in. And that was an incredible blessing. And when I went to clerk at the federal district court after leaving law school, I clerked at the United States District Court in Omaha, Nebraska, for Judge Joseph Battalion and Judge Laurie Smithcamp, and learned while I was clerking there that in that courthouse in 1879, May 12th, 1879, the first federal judge for the District of Nebraska, a gentleman named Judge Elmer Dundy, appointed by President Lincoln, declared Indians to be persons under the law. And that, of course, was the trial of Chief Standing Bear, who fought against the United States, who told him that by leaving his reservation, by leaving the Ponca Reservation down in Indian Territory so that he could bury his son, Bear Shield, with their ancestors, he had broken the law, and they threw him in jail. And he actually filed a writ of habeas corpus, and the United States attorney looked at that and said, well, the statute here says that the writ of habeas is for all persons unlawfully detained. And we know an Indian is not a person under the law. And that was really truly the debate in the federal court. And Chief Standing Bear in 1879 won. And he stood up in federal court and said, no, Indians are persons. And, you know, getting to write that play and work with the Ponca tribe and Chief Standing Bear's descendants to create that play. And then later on with the Rose Theater in Omaha as a children's play, Return to Niobrara, you know, I think it just really highlights the need, the way in which theater, I think right now, is substituting for the lack of education in the United States. You know, schools should be teaching the story of Chief Standing Bear. He's one of the very earliest American civil rights activists. I mean, talk about civil disobedience. He walked hundreds and hundreds of miles through the snow, through winter, through blizzards to bury his son with their ancestors. And you know, no, and our schools don't teach his story. They don't teach our young American students about him or what he did. And I think that that's where the power of storytelling in theater really comes in and can be that substitute when we have a less than stellar educational system in the United States. I know Illuminative did research and showed that, you know, 87% of schools don't teach about any Native people after the year 1900. So it's like we just disappeared and don't exist anymore. And that's, you know, it's harmful to Native students who go to schools in the United States and witness that erasure, but it's also harmful to the folks who, you know, go off and then go to law school and become a judge of a federal court. And they've been taught that tribes don't exist anymore. And so what does that mean? So I think I'm just really honored to be here today. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these experiences and the power of theater and what theater can achieve. And really, thank you so much, Courtney, for the invitation, and Amy and Anne. And I'm going to turn it over to Tai and let him talk. So thank you.
Miigwech. Whew. MK, so good to see you and to hear your voice, and miss you so much. And seeing you out in the theater world and everything too, but here we are. Yeah, I was really thinking about being together, working on Manahatta, and being in those pertinent conversations about your work and pieces. So it's an honor to be here, and thank you so much to the committee. And you know, I wanted to share a little bit and say bonjour to folks out there. Tai Nijnakaz waswagana nandun japa magaza nando dem wabanung rauno nagabun no kiwedunung miigwechkai ga kinigego abagana nagadego making miigwechkije manedo adapanan ao asema gajagens ikwe sug. So hello everyone. There's a small cat, is what I said, who might jump up on my lap. She definitely wants to be seen in this webinar, in this keynote today, in this virtual realm. And also a shout out to any Anishinaabe speakers out there. I'm humbled to be speaking today, as well as the Haudenosaunee people. But, you know, I grew up in a small subsistence community on a reservation in northern Wisconsin, and I was raised by a badass activist, citizen of the Oneida Nation, my mom, Patricia Defoe, who constantly underscored education in my life, and she loved eating popcorn right out of the pot because you can get that really good butter on that popcorn. She was such an amazing person. And, you know, we called her Miigwenase Kwe, which is the eagle feather woman, right? Or stands with an eagle feather. And she predicted that education was the space that will bridge the gap for Native liberation to me at a young age. And she was also a woman who worked and created education around the Indian Child Welfare Act and led the charge with the Anishinaabe Great Lakes during the Walleye Wars in the late 80s and 90s. So this is where Anishinaabe peoples were challenged about the state regulations on hunting and fishing right based on the treaties in Anishinaabe territory of St. Peter's and La Pointe. So during that time, for those of you who aren't aware of this walleye war that was happening in the Great Lakes of northern Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota, that non-Indigenous protesters would line these boat landings and they would make their cases against Native people who have been stewarding, you know, since time immemorial, these waters and fishing and bringing food to elders. The protest was saying that the Anishinaabe people were getting special treatment for fishing in these Great Lakes. So if you look up this time in history right now, or maybe later on Grandfather Google, you'll read something like they shouted offensive slogans and sometimes threw rocks at the fisher folks and the protection of the officials, right? But it's worse than that. Like non-Indigenous people at this time, protesters, they launched boats, they circled at high speed in their boats and tried knocking others off of their canoes, because there was lots of spearfishing that was going on. And this went on for years. And so some of the protesters even joined some of the elected officials to forcibly remove sound amplification devices from the leaders of our tribe that were speaking out against this. And for me at the time, I was probably about 5 years old at the time. And for me, this was a moment that later, remembering now this reading, they shouted offensive slogans and sometimes threw rocks, right? So if you Wikipedia that, you'll kind of look it up. And I remember it was spring. And I remember there was lots of rain because the raspberries were ripening there in northern Wisconsin, and it was walleye season. And I was on my father's shoulders because he had, a flannel shirt on, and he had like a hat on, and he was next to my mother, and we were ready to go fishing that day. It was fishing season. And today, these images going fishing of angry faces, people holding signs with hate language are sort of blurred, a little bit to me, because these signs had language on it that were shouting at my family and relatives because, about going fishing. And this is the first time that I learned what the N word was, what the R word was. And then all of a sudden, a small little rock hit my arm. And it was in that moment, right, when I retroactively think about this, that I wanted to be an artist. In my child brain, I thought, why were they trying to hurt us? What was the conflict that was going on here? And so from that point on, and not just a memory that I'm sharing with you all today, that created the way and mission in life and value system about amplifying the voices of Native Indigenous people for peace and understanding, and by education, and by all means possible. So that moment was definitely a movement for me. And so I answer this question about why am I a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary shapeshifting artist? It's because by any means possible, I must highlight and underscore the liberation for Native Indigenous people. At every moment, I feel like I must talk about the survival and the resilience of my people at every colonized location, theater institution, dinner table, donor table, at all the tables. It's because I'm an artist, and that's how I move in and out of these interactions as a form of liberation and self-expression as a two-spirit indigenous individual, where society by design was not made to foster learning or art making for others like me, who look like me, and who are relentlessly understanding the richness of Indigenous languages, culture, and collaboration. So I think that by valuing building relations and education and art making, we can be that change. And so that brings me to theater. Theater is a tool for social change and civic engagement. And that's why I identify the way that I do. End thought.
Thank you so much. I heard so many meaningful nuggets of wisdom in both of your memory spelling and memory sharing, Mary, Kathryn, and Tai there. And I'm so appreciative. I'm sure that all of our listeners are. I actually am going to kind of jump ahead in the script because of what you spoke about and move into this question about community engagement. Both of you have received so many awards, but not enough, in my opinion, and so many recognitions, right? Because in America, that's how we kind of signify greatness, is through kind of a hierarchical award right, and recognition schema. And obviously, we know that affords us some resources with which to continue working in a capitalist system, right? But what I both heard you talk about that I think really underscores some of the different ways that Indigenous artists see their life work is a question about community engagement. So you are both committed to connecting with Indigenous communities in meaningful and powerful ways. Would you please both offer some specific strategies for meaningful community engagement in your work?
Gosh, this is a great question. And, I think that truly meaningful connection really requires long-standing relationships. And I think that, a lot of times folks will come to me and they'll say, well, we really, our theater wants to work with a Lenape person for this one project, and can you give us someone to talk to? And that, yes, we can try to find someone who's Lenape, or depending on, what tribal community or tribal nation a theater is trying to connect with, you can always go and find a person. But I think that real meaningful connections with tribal communities and Native people needs to not be transactional, needs to not be based on, oh, we have this one thing we want a Native person to do. How do we find a Native person that we can pay $100 to do it and then be done? And really requires sort of being in community, having that relationship where, you just get to know people, and you give, right? You don't just show up and ask to receive. And I think that can be a really hard thing to do for our mainstream theater institutions, to sort of think about relationships as these really long-term intergenerational relationships that are not based on transaction or invoices or meetings or specific things like that. And so I think that's going to be a challenge for theaters as they move forward, and as we hopefully see more and more Native playwrights getting produced in theaters or having Native work performed, because those relationships are going to be critical. And I will say that I really admire a lot of the work that Tai does. I think Tai does incredible work in the community. I've done some work in the community over the years as well. It's some of the most rewarding work. I mean, some of the plays I was working on before a professional theater would ever open its doors to me, we were doing readings of plays, out on tribal lands and in tribal communities and in tribal casinos, and you name it, just bringing it to the community. Now I get to take those same plays to professional stages, and that's exciting too, but it doesn't stop the need to work with community, to engage with community. And we've got so many talented people in Indian country who are incredible storytellers, whether it's through traditional, really traditional forms of storytelling, or dance, or song, or, you name it. And I just think the more that our theaters can do to support our young Native artists in their communities, the better, because we've got so much talent. But because of the erasure in general in the United States, our Native youth don't always immediately see the role models or see the examples of what they can or can't do, because most theaters have never produced a play by a Native playwright. It doesn't seem like a possible thing. And so I think really, working with the youth and really making sure they know that things are changing, and we're working to create an American theater community where Native artists also have a seat at the table, I think is an important message for our youth to hear as well.
Aho, MK. Woo! Well, I'll respond and say thank you for all the work that you do. It just takes that full circle, doesn't it? Just everyone at every intersection who are liberating Indigenous voices through theater and through voices. Like, I just, think you do that so well in your process. And the idea about upholding relationships and valuing process and not necessarily only valuing products. So thank you so much for all the work that you do. And I'm so grateful to that we get to work with each other. And some things I'll add on to what MK said, just by working together and working with other folks too, and working with like other individuals who are doing the same work, like Larissa Fasthorth and Maddie Sayet. You know, our Indigenous women definitely are leading the charge in this. And I think that's an important thing to say, because for me, what do I have to say to people here today? It's about number one is listen, to listen. What does that mean to listen? Even if it's a no and you don't like to hear the answer, there's a type of truthfulness in listening. I think about maybe ask yourself and the places that you are a part of, what are the protocols for being on the land, right? The land is a relative. A land is a relative. I think what are the protocols for speaking to elders? I think what is the protocols just as you are visiting someone in their own home or apartment, right? I think these are some of the things I think about. And I think about when is it not appropriate to take photos or to record or to tell someone else's story, right? There's something about valuing that kind of friendship or alliance, about always asking permission, right? I think about often too going to communities and formalizing engagement. Who are the leaders in the community that are already doing the work, right? And if you don't know something, ask, right? You might not know everything. I think how do you be respectful to your surroundings and observe what others are doing around you, right? That goes around listening. And I think about being mindful of the complexities of indigeneity, right? You heard a lot today, MK and myself, talking about history. There's a lot of complexities even in native territories about indigeneity. So maybe do some research on that. And I think, be mindful of language that's perceived as offensive, okay? So noting that maybe not all folks in community, speak English, right, as their first language, that there's a multiplicity of languages going on. That means, as you all know as educators, there's a multiplicity of worldviews that are happening all at the same time. And so those are just some tangible things I hope that people can take away from this webinar today and implement those. It is not a one-size-fits-all situation. So it's really at every step of the way being mindful about how you're engaging with community.
Fantastic. I feel like you really leaned right into a topic about allyship, which is just itself taken so many different kind of meanings over time, right? Since perhaps it was first in our common vernacular. I feel like ally means something different for every kind of generation or maybe individual and context. And I feel like you've done a wonderful job, Tai and Mary, Kathryn, of sort of speaking to that. We have today an audience of thoughtful theater people here. My favorite kind of people, thoughtful theater people, many who I am going to bet consider themselves to either be an ally to BIPOC artists and communities, or who would like to learn more about how to get there. So what are the most important things these folks can do to specifically support Indigenous art, communities, and life? And I feel weird. I'm like trying to suss out whether to turn my camera on and off, and like I feel like I'm coming in and I think I'm gonna just mute myself and be here with you for this so that you can see how much I'm digging what you're saying.
Gosh, it's a great question. I mean, I think there are so many things, and I think it'd be hard to list all the different things that folks can do to truly be great allies. I think, so I'll just say what I think the most important thing is be prepared to make mistakes, because even Indigenous and Native artists make mistakes. And I think one of the biggest challenges I've had sometimes is some of our allies who care so much, and that is awesome, not wanting to admit that they've made a mistake or that they may have done something that's not great that we could do better. And I think sometimes that's really, really challenging. Is, you get a theater that's trying to hire as many BIPOC folks as possible in positions of authority on the artistic team, and that's awesome. And then they're producing their first play by, a Native playwright ever. And there are going to be mistakes that are made. There are going to be misunderstandings. it is just, I have, you know, I'm still very much, I would say, you know, kind of an emerging playwright in the American theater in terms of the number of productions I've had. So I think, you know, there are other folks who have had way more than me, but in the few that I've had, every single one of them has involved mistakes that I've made or that other people have made. And, you know, I'm just going to give a shout out to like one of my favorite collaborators that Tai and I get to work with, Laurie Woolery, who is so brave and just goes in there, and she has an open heart and she has the best intentions. And if we're in the room and it's clear that something is disrespectful or something is not actually, you know, if we're working on Manahatta and we realize that there's a costume piece that just did not adequately incorporate our Lenape cultural consultant's advice on what a Lenape person would be wearing, or some assumption was made. A lot of times assumptions are made and it's just incorrect, then we work on fixing it and we work together, and no one, and it's not a huge thing. It's not dramatic. It's just a problem we can all fix together. And I think that working with Native artists does require work, because our theater institutions have not historically worked with Native artists. So when you're inviting Native people, Indigenous communities into theater institutions, you just have to be ready and to listen, I think. And that's what Tai said earlier. And it's just, I think so often to our Native artists get to somewhere and they'll say what they need. Hey, I need this to be safe in this space, and no one listens. So I think just listening and being ready to make mistakes and being okay, like, you know, and not letting the mistakes stop the entire process, and just understanding that we're all figuring out how to work together in a way that's respectful.
Ooh, Mary Kathryn, I was in it, dropping some wisdom bombs there. I was like, wow, 100% listening. And, you know, and thanks for bringing up, you know, working on the production of Manahatta and others we have, because, you know, allyship, I think, is so pertinent. And some things I think about, how do I be an ally to other communities, right? That might not be Indigenous working in work, right? Because it's like being an artist, you work in many different collaborative forms. I constantly think about working as an ally as well, for, you know, a cross section of identities, right? For women's rights, for, you know, Black femme women, trans rights. I think about, how do I honor and celebrate relations, right? Ancestors, peers, those still yet to come, by centralizing community and development and the content and the presentation of the work. I think, how can I be responsible for initiating and welcoming and tending those reciprocal relationships, right? Where I have the privilege to practice, right? So that is an Anishinaabe value of, number one, being humble, right? Being humble is a virtue in Anishinaabe value system. I think too, I think about, wow, how can I expose and dismantle bigotry, biases, and disrespect in the world at various expressions and toxicity that impacts the environment and social and economic ecosystems and my collaborators and folks that I'm interfacing with, right? So these are some of the questions I'm asking myself if I, you know, in collaborating with others. I think about, how can I create an opportunity for new practices, right? Involving this existing wisdom, right? So like right now during COVID-19, how can I revisit and revise a practice, right? Like, how can I redo it to better create a structure to honor personal and artistic freedom amongst people that I'm collaborating with and audiences, right? And lastly, I'll say this, I think that how can I indigenize and decolonize time, space, and resources, right? Those three things, because I think, and I want to underscore here for allies, about accountability is vital to a healthy theater ecosystem. So what is your accountability system? How are you holding yourselves accountable? How are you looking inward and to each other to keep your values in practice and in alignment when you are creating work? And like Mary Kathryn said, I think folks will say it, right? It's about the listening and not measuring a barometer of who is the loudest person who is saying it, because of, right, underscoring the indigeneity here. Languages, worldview, communication are all different. So how can you continue to be intentional on every step of the process?
Oh my goodness, thank you so much. Absolutely. And we're going to indigenize and decolonize, right? Focusing on those values of listening, of reciprocity, of humility, and of grit, right? That's what I'm hearing. I love it. So I also want us to talk for a second about the different conventions, right? Both of you have been totally inspiring and creative in your use of the forms that you decide to play with, right? And the kind of blurring of the forms that you play with. So, one might say that you're unconventional, right? So you're challenging conventions through your work and your artistry. There are many ways that Indigenous theater challenges theatrical conventions. One of the many ways that Mary Kathryn's plays do this, do their theatrical magic, is by threading links in space between times, right? Often switching between two or more time periods that are intrinsically connected and meaningfully connected. Tai's performance work also shines via genre busting, convention stretching, storytelling, right? So what are some of the nuggets of advice that you can share about approaching plays that do not neatly follow a linear plot or seem to defy Western structural fixation on a singular protagonist or conflict?
Great question. I think that a lot of Native Indigenous storytelling is not linear. It's, we in different tribes, we've got different cultures that are have a different understanding or relationship with time. And we could have hours and hours of conversation comparing sort of Muskogee understandings of time and Cherokee understandings of time and Ojibwe understandings of time, and and we could go through it all. But at the end of the day, it's not. The point is that it's not this linear sense of time that you see sort of in most of Western theater that we teach here and produce here in the United States. And I think it creates challenges for our Native artists, because I think that one thing I've learned is that there is a gigantic difference, and this is true for any play or any performance, in the performance of it versus reading it on the page, right? And that's going to be true for everyone, but for Native artists especially, I think when we have non-Native people reading the scripts through their non-Native lens, without that understanding, without that connection, I think there's a lot that's misunderstood and misinterpreted, and they don't see it. And I think a lot of our plays get written off as not good, and because they're not understood. And I don't want to just talk about myself, but Manahatta, for instance, got rejected by I think 60 or 80 different theaters before the Oregon Shakespeare Festival finally agreed to produce it. And then it did really well. And I had several conversations with people, artistic directors at major theaters in the United States, who just said, it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't work. It's not a play. It's not, the way it's structured and the way it just jumps around back and forth. That's not really right for the stage. And I just think that, in terms of a Native understanding, like we understand that when we walk on the land of our ancestors, they're with us. And what's happening today is a reflection of what happened then, and what happened then is a reflection of today. It's all interconnected. You can't separate it. You can, but that creates dysfunction, I think, and trauma, which I guess is what we're all working through. But, I think that at the end of the day, the reality is just, and I think this is true for a lot of BIPOC communities, right? When your narratives have been erased or silenced, and you're really fighting for those, the right to have a seat at the table, a lot of your work is going to be misunderstood from people outside your community because they have no familiarity with your community, right? How is someone who's never been to a tribal nation or talked to a Native person, met a tribal leader, spoken to an elder, going to read a script and understand whether that's a good story or not by a Native playwright, And I just think that's where we're also really, really relying on and indebted to folks like Madeline Sayet, who runs the Yale Indigenous Performing Arts program, or Delana Studi, who runs Native Voices at the Autry. I know Tara Moses has been doing a lot of work with Native youth at Red Eagle Soaring. And, these folks are working with different Native writers to develop workshop Native plays, especially younger voices. And I think what we're starting to see is that in our own Native theater community, we are starting to say, hey, we're going to have, an under 25 Native youth writing contest, and here are the winners. And so we're saying, here are some really great Native plays, but we're having to really have those conversations within our community, because outside of the Native theater community, people who aren't familiar with Native stories read Native plays and are like, because they haven't seen it before. And it's the same thing in TV and Hollywood. I mean, how frustrating is it, when Hollywood executives are like, oh, this is the next Breaking Bad, because Breaking Bad did well. So they just want to see a TV show that is the next Breaking Bad. Well, when you've never produced a Native play or a Native show, there is no next one that you can be like, oh, this is exactly like what you've already invested money in before. And so it's been hard to fit Native writers into that model for sure.
I'll add on to that, MK, and say, in terms of this like Western fixation, right, of like the not knowing, what might this mean to confront colonistic systems that are in place, right? Like, what would it mean to confront white homogeny? Which I think is really important to underscore here, because it's talking about like social, political, economic power, and cultural worldviews that's controlled by an elite system, right? What happens when that becomes normalized? And also, how can we at every opportunity, both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, create agency at every opportunity, at every level? It goes without saying, there are folks that shout out mentioned here, but this conversation has been happening over decades, and we just lost a very prolific writer who I want to name here is Dr. William S. Yellow Robe Jr., that says, and I quote, he's like, I've never seen my writing as a career, but I've always seen it as a responsibility. Wow. So shout out to him, and may he rest in power, who has and fought and taught and, has been the loudest person in the room fighting for Indigenous Native playwrights and dramatists, as well as other folks too. Joy Harjo, who is like 2-time poet laureate, who often talks about this literary world. So I kind of am thinking about this idea of the fixation, about the system is designed to fixate and amplify some people while keeping others out. And I feel like, unfortunately, that has been Native Indigenous folks. However, that being said, we have sought each other through our moccasin telegraph, through collaboration, right? Through things like Zoom, at this time where most individuals are like, oh, what are we going to do? Are we going to go back to, end quote, normal, right, ways of being? For Native Indigenous people, playwrights, dramatists at this time, we have been able to connect with youth across Turtle Island. We have been able to communicate in new ways. So this is reminding me and thinking about Indigenous futurism and what that is to completely create new practice and ways of being and learning. So that's something I wanted to amplify in addition to the things that Mary Kathryn so brilliantly said. Scarcity appears when wealth cannot flow. And I think that is something really important to note here. I think the fixation, on the single narrative, I think that has to do with a system, and I'm, charging people today to consider undoing that we think about stories with Native Indigenous plays and people. There are a multitude of conflicts and dramas, both large and small, that are going on at the same time. And if we're talking about linearity, right, just having a line, well, if you took both of those two ends and put them together, what kind of shape would you have? Here at the Higher Education of Association, I think it's the idea is that it's a circle. Wow, a powerful, powerful symbol that everything is connected, and it's not even a two-dimensional by design, but it's it's like 3-4 dimensional, that at every intersection there's opportunities for types of conflict, types of celebration, and types of joy. And this attributely definitely speaks to storytelling and what that is. And we go back to speak to communities and elders. We are just, we are born storytellers, right? This is a way of, we aren't humans doing, but we are human beings, right? And so that's what, Anishinaabe translates to as we are human beings. And what are the ways at which all beings are moving through the world? And to me, I think about that and I'm like, whew, if you're being in the world, there's a whole host of dramas, dramedies, comedies that could happen, and they're out there. So I'm actually really excited for folks to take a deep dive into many of the playwrights. And as that being said too, folks like Mary Kathryn and, Larissa Festhorst and other folks have had to do the yes and, right? They've had to work in community presenting plays, and Mary Kathryn putting up, 19 women working on the VAWA Act, and at the same time had to create a play that was understood and dramatize it so that people and the powers that be, right, could produce a play, which is also something important to note in terms of what does it mean to be an Indigenous, right, shapeshifter, to work at all of these intersections. We've had to do the most on the land at which our ancestors are underfoot and put into the ground and then forgotten and then remembered.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. There's actually several excellent questions that have been posed in the Q&A, and I'm just going to lift up one of them. So the one that I have here is by Pamela Thielman. How can we balance the desire to incorporate Indigenous work and artists into our classrooms with the really excellent point that we shouldn't just drop in someone for an hour and expect them to represent everything about Indigenous cultures across North America? She says, I'm not in a position to create long-term relationships projects in my existing classes, but I would like to provide students with an opportunity to speak with and about Indigenous artists.
Great question. I will say, I know space and curriculum is tough, and because there's so much to teach, but I will say that, putting in a variety of Native or Indigenous writers into your curriculum is a really amazing way to show the complexities of Indian country and the differences between Native folks, that we're not all the same. So if you, for instance, in your curriculum put in, theatrical writings by Tai Defoe, Vera Bedard, Delana Studi, just there's 3 writers right there. You're going to have Bill Yellowrobe. You're going to have, there's 4 writers. You've got 4 very different voices, very different perspectives, very different writing styles, different cultures. And I just think that that in and of itself is a wonderful educational tool. I think when I've had conversations with professors, they're like, I just don't know how to teach Native writing. And I'm like, you don't have to be Native to put Native writers into your curriculum, and the writers' voices and works will teach the students something they didn't already know. And I just think that's that is one of, I think, the most important things that we can do, is to have students read Native writers. So.
Absolutely. I was reminded when I first came across, you all might know this, Exit Pursuit by Bear. What does that mean to people? Right. I'm sure you've read that. It's talked about, right? But, going back to also worldview, right? That means something totally different coming from the northern territories of cold where there are bears hibernating, right? So just to illustrate a little bit to what Mary Kathryn's talking about is reading, it's understanding work, right? It's combing over language, it's asking questions about things that you don't understand and not expecting to know everything. I think, that's really important. And definitely, I think this, grandfather Google, it does wonders for folks. The internets are very, very, very important, right? And even in that, I think it's looking up individual voices, and you will find them. For those who like to nerd out like me, you find folks that are writing in different their tribal indigenous languages. And also, I'd like to give a shout out and amplify too, like First Peoples Fund in South Dakota, as well as Native Arts and Cultures, are doing huge studies now with education in the classrooms that are out in Portland, Oregon, as well as ally organizations like in Seattle, Washington, Amplify, folks that have been working with community and have been asking these questions about accountability and agency and really getting education out there. I think oftentimes too, what's remiss is local libraries, right? We talk about localizing our food, things that we eat to put into our bodies. How about localizing things like literature or plays or art making, right? So what are the things that you're nourishing yourself and education in the classrooms? So those are just some places I would encourage folks to look.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I was just writing this actually to everybody, is that, oftentimes as someone who does dramaturgy for Native plays, I think people think, oh, if I ask someone who identifies as Indigenous to be the dramaturg on this play, I have it all set and they're going to be an expert. Well, no, there's over 500 different communities and tribal histories, art forms just in the US alone. And so it takes a lot of grit, vulnerability, humility, and dedication just to know kind of all of the questions that you have to actually ask. That's really the only thing that I provide, right? Is like, no, I'm not an expert in this. The playwright might be, probably is, and what can I do to support the playwright in the community that they are highlighting in their work, right? So I want to finish with one other question. Again, these questions are wonderful, and I will let everyone know right now that that if you want to continue this conversation after the keynote is over among ATHE members, ATHE participants, that you can go ahead and join the Keynote chat room on the conference platform. You can go to Launch Chat and from the conference platform homepage, and then go to Group Chat Topics to find the keynote discussion, so we can at least talk with each other. I'm going to put that in the chat there after we are done with this wonderful time that we have with Tai and Mary Kathryn. My last question is one that Bethany Hughes asked. I'd love to hear what the current or future projects are for you both. Can you share what work you are excited about doing right now?
Oh, great question. So I'm actually very, very honored right now that I have a commission with Roundhouse Theater located in Maryland. And actually they are allowing me to, I've written a one-woman play, and the play is about an incredible woman named Jean Hill Chowdhury, who is Muskogee and also happens to be my husband's mother. So full disclosure, but she was an incredible, incredible woman. And it's a challenging project because she was such an incredible person. Her life is hard to write into something that is short and concise, because there's so much to include. But it's also my first time writing a one-person show. I've if anyone's familiar with my work, there's usually about 10 7 to 9 actors involved at a minimum. And so it's been exciting to sort of write in a different art form, like in this style of a one-person show, and and also because she was an incredible storyteller in her own right. She wrote her own plays. In fact, one of her plays that she wrote was called Indians Discovered Christopher Columbus. And it was performed all across Indian country for years, from, with the Seminoles in Florida to different tribal communities in Arizona. She fought very hard to save the Phoenix Indian School, which is now an incredible community center there in Phoenix for tribal communities and Native folks out in Phoenix. And so the play is like a love letter to her, and we are going to be workshopping it this spring, which my understanding is, knock on wood and everything, that it will be in person. I know everyone's very concerned about the Delta variant, as we all are, especially in our tribal communities where COVID is raging once again in many. So very hopeful that we will get to do some version of it in person, but if not, maybe by Zoom. And very, very excited for that play. So thank you.
Cool. Very excited about this question. Yeah, I just got done with a reading at Portland Center Stage for a new show comedy called Trans World, about 7 transgender individuals that live together and all of the conflicts and drama that they pursue. So I'm working on that script now, which I'm very excited about. But also wanted to invite folks out, if you are in, I guess, the Chicago area. In January, I'll be part of the Chicago International Puppet Festival. And this is a piece I'm very excited about called Kanamad, and it's I think it's going to be very exciting there. Skeleton Canoe, and it'll be the end of January, so come on out. It'll be a work in progress at the American Indian Center of Chicago that's partnering with the Chicago Field Museum as well as the festival. And what's exciting is really thinking about indigenous puppetry and what that is, and elicited a really amazing carver in Michigan named Kevin Finney that's doing a lot of community work, as well as Mark Denning, that is a cultural advisor, community fire holder, and we are putting this show together. And so we'd love for you all to check that out. And you can check this out on allmyrelations.earth, which is the collective that I'm a part of. We're doing some things with trying to engage people at all intersections. So those are shows that are up and coming. And then if you're in Northwest Arkansas, I'm putting together a Two-Spirit Indigiqueer pop-up powwow there with performances by Indigiqueens. If you've never seen one, come on out to participate in some of the performances there. And it's a theater extravaganza piece that we're putting together. And I can send more information to you all. It's at the Momentary at Crystal Bridges. That's sponsored by Fusebox Festival. So it's this multi-immersive sort of Sleep No More Indigenous queer piece that I think people will be kind of very excited about.
Oh my goodness, listen to that. So exciting, incredible. I feel like I'm going to be really bad and not respectful of time by being like, I'm asking one more question, even though we only have 2 minutes, because it's my right. Okay. So I love this question, Lillian, that Lillian wrote in the chat here, from Lillian Mengesha. Can you describe a time when you were in a collaborative arts experience where it felt entirely reciprocal, safe, Indigenous-centered, and thus successful? Sensorially, what was happening? We each get a minute, and then they're gonna like black us out. I don't know.
I will just say, like, getting to work with Tai on Manahatta was that experience oftentimes for me. We all made mistakes during that production. We all learned. But there were so many moments where we were in the rehearsal room, and a lot of it had to do with the way in which OSF under Bill Rausch's leadership supported us and the different folks who were there. But also, honestly, had a lot to do with Tai and Laurie Woolery, who worked very hard to create a space where we could explore things like the scalping of one of our ancestors that we basically did on stage, and whether or not, recreating that trauma, even though it's a true trauma that occurred, did that serve the story? Did that take the story to a deeper place, or would it just trigger people in the audience and harm people and create more PTSD? And we had these kinds of conversations. And for our actors, Native and non-Native, it's not easy. It's very hard for Native people, I think, to tell these stories unless you can do it in a safe space. And I think that I just want to say that Tai was there. He was the movement choreographer, but he also, in a lot of ways, wore this hat where he just protected the community and protected everyone in the room and made sure that we were in a safe space. And it made all the difference. And I think part of the play's power are just the people who came together to create it, and the way in which they approached each other with so much respect. And so I will say that, and then let Tai answer.
Ooh, when Native Sister asks you to show up, you show up in full force. And definitely I would say Manahatta, 100% MK, just even your essence being there, the way that you participated as a playwright, in that role that went beyond your voice. Laurie Woolery, leading the charge in that is a Latina who, we're collaborating with. And when I think about the successes of that, I think about healing, liberation, remembering, nourishment, regeneration, truth-telling, and at the end of the day, deepening democracy. And these are the values, in that system that I think that Manahatta, for my own personal circle, box checking, fill in the blank, it definitely takes all of those value system to another level. And so that was like a huge successful collaboration, and deeply proud of everyone in that show and work for all the things that Mary Kathryn said, and also for the container at which was holding, so that we can show up as our full selves with all of the emotions, all of the anger, all of the laughter, all of the joy, for smudging in the space, for thinking about, as Vine Deloria speaks about, the world unseen, that I think was very important during that process.
Kakinash, thank you so much from my heart. It is a profound honor to be in these little bubbles with you, these little screen boxes. I can somehow magically feel your energy even through them, and it's really incredible and inspiring. Our time has ended. It was too short, and I just want to say thank you again, and thank you. This was a well-attended, and from what I am gathering in the chat, it looks like a meaningful conversation for all of the allies in the room, for our Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies in this room. So thank you so much. And this is always so awkward, saying goodbye in this space. I've never one time figured out how to do this in a way that is not super awkward. So I'm gonna lean into that and just be like, bye, bye.
Yeah, or the one where you like unsilence and everyone speaks and it's like,
Yeah, we can do that. Everybody unsilence.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Miigwech.